morning, everyone. You've noticed that our speaker today is a national speaker for the Phi Beta Kappa Society, so I'll say a few words about Phi Beta Kappa. It's the oldest honor society for the liberal arts and sciences. It was founded at the College of William and Mary in 1776, and for the last 240 years, it has promoted academic excellence. It was the first society in America to use Greek letters, which stand for Philosophia Viu Kybernetes, or loosely translated, love of learning as a guide of life. FNM's chapter, the Theta of Pennsylvania, was founded in 1908. And every year, Phi Beta Kappa identifies a group of students from FNM's student body who have demonstrated academic excellence, rigorous pursuit of the liberal arts and sciences, breadth of intellectual perspective, deliberation and ethical reflection, and the love of learning as the guide of life. New members are inducted in a ceremony at graduation every year. And in order to promote this pursuit of academic excellence, the national headquarters of Phi Beta Kappa have initiated a visiting scholarship program, which this year celebrates its 60th anniversary. The Visiting Scholar Program identifies the nation's most distinguished scholars and invites them to spend 2 whole days visiting a college campus. Our speaker today is one of such 13 Phi Beta Kappa national scholars, and we're extremely fortunate to have her at Franklin and Marshall. Before introducing our speaker, I want to thank the National Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society, of course, and the officers of our local society who have helped organize the event, President Donnell Butler, Vice President John Stone, Secretary Gretchen Myers, Treasurer Kate Snyder. I also want to thank Bonchek College House for sponsoring a reception immediately after Common Hour, and I invite you all to attend. There we go. Okay. I cannot tell you how excited I am to have Professor Bruzelius at Franklin and Marshall College, one of the most notable scholars in the field of medieval studies and in art history. To this day, I remember how I practically jumped off my seat at my graduate carrel when I first read a little footnote in 1991 in an article published by the Journal of Society of Architectural Historians, where Dr. Bruzelius had identified ethnic intentionality in medieval material culture, or to be more specific, that something as banal as a roof tile that we archaeologists tend to toss in the excavation dump could express a French rather than a German or an Italian manner in the Angevin Kingdom of Sicily. Before Caroline Bruzelius, our entire narrative of medieval art was based on French cathedrals. Few scholars had ventured into French Gothic in what we might call today a colonial setting, French Gothic outside of France, and particularly in the south in Italy. Bruzelius is the author of many books and articles. She did France in her first book on the 13th century Church of Saint Denis in 1986, a major place where, as you know, Abbot Suger invented Gothic. And then she moved on to Naples. Her 2004 Stones of Naples, church building in Angevin, Italy, 1266 to 1343, established not a whole new field, but also a new method of research to synthesize medieval material culture to understand what we might now call globalization, or at least an early proto-colonialist environment. It was followed by the 2011 Medieval Naples, an Architectural and Urban History, 400 to 1400, which continues to serve as the basic scholarly guide of the city's 1,000 years. Bruzelius literally wrote the book on Naples. Bruzelius also explores how women's histories are different than men's in the medieval world, and how different urban and socioeconomic realities transformed religious experience. Her most recent book, Preaching, Building, and Burying, Friars in the Medieval City from 2014, investigates preaching literally out in the streets as a form of architectural and social experience. Professor Bruzelius is the A.M. Cogan Professor of Art and Art History at Duke University. From 1994 to 1998, she was also the director of the American Academy in Rome, the most prestigious research institution for archaeology, classics, the arts, and architecture. Bruzelius was elected as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. But of equal importance is Bruzelius' pioneering work in the field of digital humanities, particularly as an educator through the Duke Wired program that she helped found in 2009, a program that tries to link the teaching of art history and material culture to an undergraduate audience using new tools of visualization, computers, and technology, which completely transformed the way that Duke does its traditional art history program. Not only am I excited that Professor Bruzelius is here as a leading medieval architectural historian in the world, not only am I excited because she is a Phi Beta Kappa national speaker and we've got to have her here, I'm also excited because she has given the last 2 days of visiting with us, talking to students, also helping us visualize what the arts will look like in a 21st century campus as we all collectively rethink the arts quadrant that we are in the process of pulling together. So please help me welcome Professor Bruzelius to Common Hour.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you. I am delighted to be here at Franklin and Marshall. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks also to the Phi Beta Kappa Association. Through these lectures that I've been giving all over the country, I have met amazing and wonderful people, spent a lot of time with students, and it has been really very exciting to see the kind of continued passion for the humanities that is so much part of our American culture and is quite wonderful. I have to say, I come from Duke University, and if I were to tell Coach K that I was giving a lecture about Gothic cathedrals underneath a basketball hoop, he would probably faint. But here I am, and I'm going to try to do this at home too. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming. So, there could be no more beautiful buildings. Oh, we've got some. Yeah, there we are. Thank you. No more beautiful buildings created by mankind, I think, than the Gothic cathedral. Buildings that really are the expression of faith, of spirituality, than these huge cathedrals which survive, not all of them, as you'll see, but many, to the present time. And I could talk about cathedrals in terms of style and construction. We could spend a wonderful hour, indeed several years, doing that. But I'm going to focus this talk in a different way. But before I start that, I would like to say that a cathedral is a particular kind of building. And we need to understand, of course, that medieval religion was Catholic. If you weren't Catholic, you were a heretic, and that was not good for your health. So we're talking about the Catholic Church, of course, and that the cathedral represents the church of a bishop. That is part of an administrative structure. Bishops report to archbishops, and archbishops report to the papacy in Rome. And the Pope has his authority directly through St. Peter, the descendants of St. Peter, and an authority conferred upon Peter by Christ. So if we think of that as a kind of chain of command, right, from Christ himself down through the hierarchy of the church, we can really understand that the cathedral is really God's house on earth, right? It represents the dominion of religion. It represents a whole system in which the cathedral is really the visible expression on earth of divine authority. And today, I'm going to take some case studies, the Cathedral of Chartres in particular, but also a couple of other buildings, Noyon, Reims, the Cathedral of Metz. Maybe some of you have been to these places. And consider them in terms of three themes. In terms of the life of a building, that is to say that when we go to Europe and we see cathedrals today, we don't necessarily see them as they were intended to be seen as they were built, and I'll explain that in a minute. We also, I'm going to talk about the cathedral and the laity in terms of a kind of dynamic, sometimes conflictual relationship. I'm going to talk about paying for buildings. After all, if you have a house, if you've remodeled your kitchen, if you live on a campus, you know that architecture is expensive, right? And it requires resources, very considerable resources, to put up a spectacular building like the Cathedral of Amiens here. And then I'm going to talk about cathedrals as centers of juridical authority, that is, cathedrals as part of an urban system of government. And that was true in large measure until the French Revolution. And I'll be talking, I should specify about cathedrals in France. So let's start looking at these questions in relation to some buildings. I just want to ask, is the sound okay? Yes? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So, one of the most remarkable cathedrals is, of course, Chartres Cathedral, and I'm showing you an old view of Chartres in the city to make the point, however, that the cathedral was part of an urban network, not only of houses of laymen. Not sure this is working. No. Houses and other churches, right? We have a whole community. So we can imagine our cathedral encased within city walls, within a community of buildings and people. And Chartres has a unique quality of coming down to us through the centuries largely intact. That is to say, the cathedral itself, its stained glass, its sculpture, as you know if you've been there, are mostly still there. But I want to emphasize that this is a rare circumstance, that very often our cathedrals are kind of remains of lots of other things that were in them and around them and on them. For example, it's very important to remember that in the Reformation, that is the 16th century, the altars of cathedrals, the statues, the paintings that filled the interiors of these buildings, right, were demolished, deliberately demolished, burned, and if not actually destroyed, then removed. And you might reflect upon this, that if you think of the museums of the United States, right, that many of the artworks that are religious artworks would have come from a church, often a cathedral. Our cathedrals are left us a legacy of works of art that fill the Metropolitan, right? If you look at the wonderful collection of Renaissance painting in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you'll see altarpiece after altarpiece, right? These come from great big buildings, and they have been displaced and put on the art market, but they were meant to be seen, not in a museum, but in a religious context. Thank you. I'm getting a whole team of helpers here. Thank you. Great. So, when we go to a museum, we need to remember about those things, those things that were meant to be in sacred spaces. Cathedrals were also demolished. After the French Revolution, I'm showing you here a view of one of these North French cathedrals that we can only show you in a drawing because so many of them were completely destroyed. And their sculpture was also torn off the facades. Here is a view of Lyon Cathedral. Most of you will know it for its restaurants. But if you go to the cathedral, you will see that the doorways that once were full of sculpture have been emptied out. And here we have a drawing made in the early 19th century of people actually hammering off and pulling off the sculpture of cathedrals. Now, great personal fortunes were made by demolishing buildings and selling the stone. And here you have a Parisian church. It's not the Cathedral of Paris, I'm glad to say, but the very important Franciscan Church of Paris being torn down. And that stone is in the foundations of the 19th century apartment buildings of Paris. So the materials have been reused, and great fortunes were made by using cathedrals as quarries. So we have to understand then that the Reformation, the French Revolution destroyed a lot of these buildings, but that wasn't the only thing that happened. We also have the tragedies of the last century, World War I, and here is Reims Cathedral taking a direct hit in about 1917, leaving the building as a kind of hulking wreck, and you can see it here in a post-World War I photograph. I would like to say that as Americans, we should be very proud because it was indeed American financiers who helped pay for the restoration of this cathedral and many other buildings. But that wasn't the end of disasters because, as many of you know, World War II, especially in Normandy, but also in South Italy led to an awful lot of destruction. And here you have a view of the city of Caen in northern France, in Normandy, as it looked at the end of World War II. So our cathedrals that have survived, right, have been restored, fixed up, repaired, put back together, and they are also lacking a lot of the beautiful interior decoration that they once would have had. I want to talk about how the cathedral was part of the city and integrated, but also separate from its community around it. And we can turn to the example of Chartres as a case study, because when we look at photographs, like this one, we tend to see the cathedral in a kind of splendid isolation. But if we think about it, actually, this cathedral was like the yolk of an egg. It was inside a precinct, and I think you can see my pointer here, right? Here's the cathedral, here's a precinct. It was essentially a walled city within a walled city. And the rest of the town was located all around it. In fact, the Cathedral of Chartres had a very conflicted, indeed sometimes even violent, relationship with the Count of Chartres, whose palace was right down here. So we have the cathedral on one hand with its juridical authority, that is its courts, its prisons, its whole system of governance, and we have the Count, who has the same rights but for different people. There were a lot of examples in the city of Chartres of the Count going head to head against the bishop and the cathedral clergy about who had the right to try a person over a certain crime, for example, who had the right to imprison a person, who had the right to set the rates of the costs of certain items. So these are really very complicated and contested areas of jurisdiction in medieval cities. If we look close at the cathedral precinct at Chartres, you can see this area in the red box is where the bishop had his palace. Now, the palace we have nowadays is 18th century, so are his gardens, but you can see that within the precinct of the cathedral, and again, follow my pointer here, right? The bishop had his own private zone, a whole area that he dominated, whereas the clergy were located on the other side, where they had houses and courtyards and so on. And then the cathedral precinct at Chartres also had a whole area of a hospital, which was very important because, after all, the relics of the Virgin, Chartres has the tunic that the Virgin Mary wore when the Christ child was born. And that tunic was held to have, of course, miraculous powers. So almost every cathedral, and we'll see that over and over, had a hospital attached to it and had a kind of medicinal capacity, right, where proximity to the relics and the positive function of prayer would help you, before modern medicine, get over whatever was ailing you. It even, here at number 3, had its own grain storage warehouse. And if you go to Chartres, this is one of the most remarkable functional buildings that you can visit that still survives, that was attached by a kind of bridge, you can see that here, to the cathedral precinct and where grain was stored. So we have a lot of different populations, and in fact the enclosed precinct of Chartres had its own system of workers, semi-servile people who were the shoemakers, who were the cloth weavers, who sold wine and bread, right? All those people were attached to the legal authority of the bishop and the clergy, and they were separate from the rest of the people in the town of Chartres, which is why those jurisdictional battles took place. So in a medieval cathedral, we have a kind of complicated social relationship between the people of the cathedral. I might be a serf working and weaving cloth for the bishop, for example, right, and the people in the town. And that kind of complicated separation is also expressed not only around the cathedral, but even inside. So here we are inside Chartres, and we're looking towards the altar area. Here are the windows. But you'll see that until the 18th century, when it was destroyed, there was a very substantial architectural element here, a wall, a screen, that stretched across the front of the area of the altar and enclosed the clergy and separated the clergy and the main altar away from the people in the church. So lay people, like us, right, we would have been out here where these people are. And there are altars in that screen where we might have worshipped, but the main altar, which is here, would have been separate and not accessible to us as ordinary people, right? So we have the separation of the church into different zones of access, even different areas of spiritual connection, we might say, with the primary mass that takes place at the main altar. A kind of social and spiritual zoning that had to do with levels of society and social separation. So that's really interesting at Chartres. You won't see that choir screen. Here it is on an old plan. It's this structure here. You can see it had rib vaults. It was quite a separate little micro architecture. And these are the stalls where the priests or the canons of the cathedral would have had their seat, the bishop's throne here, and then the main altar, right? A separate precinct within the church itself. Now, I can show you another really interesting example of this kind of spatial zoning of the sacred in another Gothic cathedral. And this is the great cathedral of Metz, which is over in eastern France, very close to the border with Germany. And when we look down the Cathedral of Metz, as in this view, you see it's a very unified and harmonious space. But if we turn 180 degrees and we look towards the entrance wall of the cathedral, and that's what we're doing here, I wonder if you look carefully, if you look inside the red box, you can see that this kind of support, right, which is kind of complicated with shafts, becomes much simpler. It becomes simple columns here, right? So we have the architectural details. And you have to spend time and look at these things when you go to these buildings. The architectural details are signifying social zoning of space. And we begin to understand that social zoning if we look at a ground plan, right? Here are those columns, plain columns I was talking about, and here's the more complicated sort of supporting element. And you'll see that when you look at a plan, you're really beginning to see this cathedral as consisting of two sort of separate parts, this part here and this whole part here. In fact, this area was a parish church. This was where lay people went to celebrate the Mass, right? This is a little separate church structure. It had its own entrances. It used to have a wall that separated it off from the clergy's part of the church, which is way bigger and way fancier. So we can imagine then that this spatial zoning gave, let's say, I don't know, 5/6 of the total mass of the building was pretty much reserved for the clergy and the nobility, and the lay people in the town, those who worshipped in this church, were pretty much restricted to the parish church, which was right here. Now, that parish church is very nice. If we look at the altar area, we can see beautiful windows. We see the altar here, a wonderful decoration all around it. It's very nice. We're not going to complain, right? But on the other hand, when we look at the rest of the church, we see a magnificent structure that was really dedicated to the upper hierarchy of the clergy. So that's one thing that's interesting to think about, how cathedrals and how in the post-revolutionary France, right, we have obliterated all those kinds of spatial divisions. Let me show you another very cool place, and this is a cathedral in Switzerland, the Cathedral of Lausanne, which is built, however, in a very French Gothic style. When we look at it today, right, again, we see a very spectacular cathedral with towers and so on, projecting over a city, and we can go inside, and we see the building as, again, a very unified whole. But let me show you a ground plan that's going to tell another kind of story, the story that was the main story, maybe, of this cathedral until the middle of the 19th century when everything was changed. Until then, this cathedral consisted here of this structure. And here you can see the choir screen, the same kind of division that we had just seen at Chartres. This is where the priests and the bishop would have had their stalls, and the main altar is here. Then we have the church ending, and then we have a west facade. So then we have the towers of the western end. And there seems to be a road going right through the cathedral. And in fact, there was. There was a road going right through the cathedral because the town market was up here. Town access, because Lausanne is on a hill, so access for the public was down below the cathedral. So people had to take the road. You can see the road is right here, right through the cathedral to get from their houses to the main city market. And the west facade was built as a kind of somewhat optimistic, eventually we'll get there kind of connection to the rest of the building. So until about 1850 or so, this is what it would have looked like. We have our beautiful Cathedral of Lausanne over here, we have our facade over here, and we have a road going right through it, right? A road going right through it that would make the market accessible to people. Now, in the 19th century, it was decided to pull all this together, finish it up, make it a little more respectable, so they closed up the cathedral, and now you have to circumnavigate it, right, to get to the market, which is still way up here. But in fact, they obliterated this kind of functional division of the church into separate parts in order to create a kind of nice, unified concept of cathedral space. So with that in mind, I want to turn to another building. This is one of my very favorite cathedrals, and this is a cathedral that nobody really goes to very often, but it's in a remarkable part of France, as I'll show you, a very beautiful agricultural area, and it's certainly the wealth of that area that enabled the bishops to build the cathedral that you see right here, soaring once again over the city walls and the rest of the town around it. Now, Noyon is located in Picardy, and Picardy is to the northeast of Paris. It's one of the wealthiest parts of France. It's wealthy because it had extraordinary farms and fields, a little bit like what you see out here in Pennsylvania, right? Wonderful land for growing things. But it also was very closely connected through rivers to the English Channel, so to all the trade, especially in wool, right, that was coming from England to France, and that was such an important part of the economics of the medieval economic revolution. So it had trade from farming, but it also had trade simply because it was near the main routes that connected England and England's wool to the rest of the world. We can look at this cathedral. It's one of the earliest ones that was built. It's not terribly tall. It's about 74 feet tall and 29 feet wide, but it's one of the earliest cathedrals we have that pulls together a lot of the ideas that characterize the Gothic style: pointed arches, rib vaults, verticality, large windows, right? Those are the things we associate with this architecture. When we look at the plan, if you look at that plan carefully, I'm tempted to stop and ask a question. Does anybody see anything strange about this plan? Right? It's kind of banana-shaped, right? It sort of curves. You can't see that so well in the photographs, but when you actually have a measured plan, you can see that the cathedral sort of bends slightly to the south side, right? Now, why is that? That's because this cathedral was being squeezed in to an urban topography that was quite complicated and that was conditioned by pre-existing factors. All our medieval cathedrals were actually built within cities that had fortifications that had been built in the late Roman Empire. At the town of Noyon, you can see in this dotted line here, you can see the line of the old walls that date from the 4th century. And the cathedral is here at number 1. And our east end, that is to say, this whole zone here, had to be built on a foundation, which is this little bump right here, that was built on top of the moat of the Roman town, right? So they had to fill in the moat and start construction on the altar area which is the part they almost always build first, right? And build that up while they continue to offer services in the old cathedral. So this is very schematic, but we can imagine it this way. The old cathedral is here at A, right? We have to offer the Mass every day. We have to be able to give people the sacraments. We can't just stop for 150 years because we're building a cathedral, right? So we have the liturgy that must, like a drumbeat, continue every single day in the life of the community. We have our Gallo-Roman wall here at B, and then we have the new project going up outside, trying not to interrupt the cathedral space so that liturgy can continue, right? So it's because they're starting to build the new building outside the walls while the old building is here, right, that they get the axis aligned, they get the alignment skewed, and so the cathedral really isn't straight the way this particular basketball court is straight. And as I said, we can't really see it too well, but nonetheless, when you go to Noyon and stand right here in the middle of the main aisle, you'll actually perceive a slight twisting off to the right side. As one of the earliest Gothic cathedrals, it's interesting to ask the question, how did the bishop pay for this? And that's a wonderful question, because we have to remember that bishops in the medieval period had enormous power. The Bishop of Noyon was what we call a peer of France. That was like the king's cabinet. He was one of 12 who was a special close advisor to the King of France. And in the case of this bishop, he was actually a cousin of the King of France. He was also not only bishop of the diocese of Noyon, but he had another diocese under his jurisdiction. So he actually split his job between two different geographic areas. He had income from all the land under his possession, so that he could, and I'll come to the details about that in just a moment, he could impose a tax on all the guilds, so the cloth weavers, the cloth dyers guild, each of them had to pay the bishop a certain proportion of their income. He could levy a tax on all the river ports and all the bridges, and for that matter, all the roads. He could also tax the mills that were very important for grinding the grain to make bread, or the fullers' mills that made felted cloth. He could also tax wine presses. Here the roads, right? He could tax those important commercial routes that went down from England towards the Alps. He could establish favorable rates of currency on monetary exchange. Now that's important because you want to remember that in the Middle Ages, there wasn't just one currency. Every town had its own currency. So that would mean that if you went from here to York or here to Harrisburg, you'd have to change money when you got to the city gates, right? And if the bishop can tax that money exchange, that's a very nice source of income. And of course, he had law courts, and he could impose fines on people who committed crimes. So I would like to know if anybody would like to complain right now about American taxation. In fact, I could go into more detail. I could actually give you a list of some of the income available to the bishop, who was also the count of this territory. He could tax every item of merchandise sold. Well, we have that, right? North Carolina, it's 7%. But he could also do this tax called rouage. That was a tax on every single cart that was carrying goods to the market, right? Tax on money changing, I already talked about. He had the right of jouage, which was the right to regulate weights and measures, and he could do that in such a way that he could tax them at a higher rate. He had the right, the Bishop of Noyon, to buy animals and meat at a price that he set himself, right? So, pretty nice deal. And he had the rights to tolls and justice and so on, and he had the income from farms and rents, right? So he owns a lot of property. So one really interesting thing is that cathedral building coincides largely with writing, the revival of writing wills. And most of us, if we're good citizens in our will, right, we're going to leave a donation. We're going to leave a donation to Franklin and Marshall College for inviting me to speak. right? And over the centuries, the church is going to get an awful lot of those donations. Mostly in the Middle Ages, they're going to be donations in the form of property and houses. So you can imagine a kind of ever-growing patrimony of physical possessions, right, of land, of buildings, of houses, and the income that can come to the bishop and his clergy from those sources, right? So we have, in fact, a situation in France where, when we get up to the French Revolution in the late 18th century, the church actually owns somewhere, and it's hard to get a good figure, somewhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of all agricultural land was under the authority of the church. That's an incredible situation, right? That's a situation of dramatic injustice, so that people who farmed almost also always did so as tenant farmers on the property, either of a noble, and they were important too, or a church who could also, a churchman who could also be a noble at the same time. The one thing I've left out of these two lists, but perhaps the most obvious thing, right, are the voluntary donations that were made to the church on the basis of offering of the sacraments. So you get your child baptized, you get married, you get last rites, your funeral, your burial. All of these entailed what are called customary donations. There's no actual menu that says it's going to cost you $5 to baptize your child, right? This was understood, but these donations represented an important part of the income of the clergy. And that's important because buildings like Reims Cathedral here are going to cost a massive amount of money. And it's precisely the tension, I'm going to suggest to you, precisely the tension between the ambitions of bishop builders and the cost of this magnificent architecture that is going to lead to a lot of social stress in the Middle Ages. So I'd like to take my last example here. It's going to be the glorious Cathedral of Reims, which has also survived, in spite of World War I, in fairly good condition. You can see, even in this general picture, that the sculpture is largely intact. And if we were to go inside, you'd also see that many of the stained glass windows have also survived. So going to Reims is a remarkable experience, not only in architecture, but in the arts of carving and the art of stained glass making that was so remarkable in the Middle Ages. But I'd like to take you through a story that's about Reims and the city, a kind of complicated story that's behind the building of this magnificent and huge building. And again, we're going to go to maps and plans. So here we are, and this pink zone is more or less the cathedral precinct. You can see it here. Our dotted line is the old Roman wall. Reims was a big and important Roman city, so this is a much bigger town than Noyon was. And here is the Roman wall that enclosed it and protected it against the barbarian invasions of the 5th and 6th centuries. The other walls you see here are much later medieval walls that encase the sort of suburbs and protect them, and that includes some areas that had been cemeteries where various martyred bishops had been buried long before. But all that is sort of after our story. We're going to focus right in here on our cathedral precinct, and I'm going to show you a situation that's really very much like the situation we saw at Chartres. Here we have the cathedral in white. The bishop, this time he gets the sunny side. He has this whole pink area. He has a palace. He has rooms for servants. He has a great hall. And he has his own chapel, which is right here, this little bump. The whole purple area belongs to the canons, the upper clergy, of whom there were about 140. Each one of whom was supported by the income derived from agricultural domains, right? They have their own cloister. You can see that here, right? They have a great garden. I'll show you that in a moment. And down here we have the whole hospital area, very much like Chartres Cathedral. If we look at an old engraving, we can see it sort of like this. These red areas are the areas of the canons who collectively are known as a chapter, right? A group of priests who live in community, but who have private houses. You can see those houses here, right? And other houses up here, and even a garden that extends partly along this whole zone. They have a cloister, and they even, if we look carefully, obviously had their own courts, because if you look carefully, and this is a French plan, it says prison du chapitre. So they have their own prisons and they have their own law courts. So in the case of Reims, we have not only the bishop having a court and prisons, and you can see that over here. Here are the prisons of the bishop, right? But you can see that the chapter had, so that kind of social situation is even more complicated, more subdivided, and more areas of overlapping jurisdiction and contestation. We tend to think in the United States that religion is separate from the state. But what you're seeing here, of course, is that religion and the state are completely integrated, right? That the bishop has all these rights that we would normally attribute to our city hall, right? But in the Middle Ages, those were largely fused together. So much so that we have the situation at Reims Cathedral of 2 sets of prisons and 2 sets of courts. And at another cathedral, which some of you I hope know, at the Cathedral of Strasbourg, outside the doorways of the south transept, this whole area, which had a statue of Solomon on it, we actually had an outdoors law court that was performed right here adjacent to the cathedral, right? Emphasizing the fact that these buildings represented not just the spiritual dominion, but in fact a whole system of economic and political jurisdiction, right, that governed the entire area that they supervised. So when we come back and look at our beautiful cathedral, right, with lavishly covered with sculpture, and the sculpture even down here on the doorways, I'm making a guess here, it's about, each of these figures is maybe 12 to 14 feet tall, so massive amount of stone being carved into figures, right? And the stained glass. We can look at this in many, many ways. We can look at it as a beautiful building, which is the way most art historians do, a beautiful building that contains all these other arts, but we can also look at it as a social phenomenon, right? A phenomenon that impacted in every possible way the people that lived within the archdiocese of this particular cathedral. And in fact, for those people at Reims, this was very complicated indeed, because the bishop and the canons kept running out of money. They kept running out of money in spite of all those sources of income that I just told you about, and trying to find new ways to raise cash. I'm sympathetic. I have this problem too. But I don't necessarily have all the authority that the bishop had to pull money in. So our cathedral is begun in 1210. Already by, look at this, 1221, the bishop needs indulgences. Now, indulgences, you know, are one of the things that Luther most opposed, right, in the Reformation. Indulgences were the sale of days out of purgatory so that you could get to heaven faster. So at Reims Cathedral, first the Pope offers 20 days out of purgatory, then in 1246 he offers more days out of purgatory, and so on, so on. There's a kind of inflation of indulgences that goes on over the 13th century, and they are invented, the phenomenon of indulgences, in order to help pay for the beautiful architecture that we admire now. Those indulgences, over and over again, they helped not only build the cathedral, but because this is the coronation of the coronation church of the kings of France, it helped pay for those huge events as well. Not enough money. In 1233, only 23 years after construction begins, the Archbishop says, and his name is Henry, oh, I've got to find new sources of revenue, and he taxes. So the burghers of Reims have made a loan to a local town. He wants a percentage of that loan. By that time, the people of Reims are completely fed up, and they besiege the Archbishop's palace. They attack the chapter. They kill the bishop's marshal. They take the stones that are there lying on the ground as part of the construction project and use them to build barricades in the street, and they chase the bishop and the canons out of the city, and they're in exile for 3 years, right? The unfinished cathedral is some kind of large hulk looming over a social urban situation of great stress and conflict, and it has to do with that old bugaboo of daily life, taxation. In the end, of course, Archbishop Henri finishes his cathedral. He wins this battle. He has the support of the crown. He has the support of the papacy. And this cathedral, as you may know if you've been, was finished in the most magnificent and glorious way. And here you see it as it looks after it was completed. But I want to point out in closing that the bishop, the archbishop actually, had the last word. So this photograph is kind of bleached out. But if you look down the length of the cathedral and you look to the massive stained glass windows that are here, that are about 60 feet tall, windows, stained glass at 60 feet tall. This window on the right here, represents who? Well, it represents the crucifixion. You can see part of that here. It represents the Virgin and Child, who are represented here. There's part of an architectural motif, which is the cathedral building, and then there's Archbishop Henry, right? He puts himself right there so that he's the main person that you see. So just to bring this to a close, you know, we think about cathedrals as places of peace and places of spiritual renewal, and they are. Of course they are. They are remarkable. But they're also places that, during the process of building, right, imposed a lot of complication on the lives of ordinary people in the towns, in the geographic regions around them. But nonetheless, when we look at a late 15th century painting, and this is one of the most beautiful paintings of the Last Judgment by the wonderful Flemish painter Hans Memling, right, done in 1467. Here's a scene of the Last Judgment, right? The Day of Judgment, people coming out of the tombs and being separated off between the saved, which are over here, and the damned, which don't have such a good time going down here to the fires of hell, right? But what's wonderful for me is to look at this image and see that when the saved come to the doorway of heaven, right, they come to a cathedral. They come right up to that door. Thank you.
History major. My question is, what do you think the atmosphere was when there was a transition from the Romanesque to the Gothic? Because I know starting with Abbot Suger with Saint Denis, after that caught on, everything kind of exploded. So what happens that it instantly just like caught on and it got so popular among Western Europe?
Isn't on. Can this be turned on? Are we on now? Yeah. Okay. So the question was, what happens why do we move from wonderful Romanesque, yes, to Gothic architecture? And I think, of course, that one answer is fashion, right? I mean, we wear our clothes. We don't wear 19th century clothes. We wear clothes in 2015. But the other thing, I think, was the brilliance of Gothic structure and, above all, light. Right, that by the innovations, the technological innovations that went into Gothic, the pointed arch, the rib vault, you could open up the windows. You could create windows that were half as high as a total building, right, and flood the interior with light. And that, of course, enhanced the spiritual value of buildings. And it could convey, as you see in this detail of that window, right, it could also convey both religious and theological messages as well as political messages. And Henry of Brenne is here in the window, obviously, for that reason. So Gothic was a terrific technological advance over Romanesque and permitted, through the flying buttress and the advantages, structural advantages of the pointed arch, to deflect the weight away from the walls so that you could open them up to glass. And you talked about Abbot Suger. What does he write about? He doesn't write about the architecture. He writes about the glass, right? He's in love with beautiful, shiny things, and the glass is part of that.
Hi, my name is Julia Zelensky. I'm a senior. I was at Vietnam last spring as part of my study abroad, and there's a number of churches and cathedrals in Vietnam from the French imperialistic movement. And I was wondering if any of these social pressures played into imperialism when the cathedral was exported from Europe into other parts of the world. And particularly, some of the cathedrals that we saw were squeezed into urban areas. So I was wondering if you could comment a little on that.
Wow, that's a wonderful subject about which I know nothing. Because I don't work on 19th century colonialism and the Far East. But I think that, you know, wherever you go, the New World, I mean United States and South America or Asia or Australia, you're going to see Gothic architecture being exported as a statement, right? I mean, not only as a church where people worship, but also a statement of possession, if I can put it that way. And the Gothic style, which undergoes a revival in the early 19th century, becomes very much part of the British exportation of identity to these new terrain. And I think also for France and Vietnam as well. But I would love to know more about the subject, and maybe you can teach me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Professor Cooper from Religious Studies Department. I want to thank you for your presentation about some of the social life on the ground. And I wondered if you would tell us a little bit about the importance of the cathedral for the development of medieval education.
Yeah.
If just a few words, please.
Of course. Well, that again is several years, you know, of talking. But of course, the cathedrals were centers of theological training, and that becomes increasingly important in the 12th century. So Chartres had a cathedral school, and it is through the cathedral school at Chartres, for example, that the writings of Plato and Aristotle are brought to Europe and translated and made accessible to the clergy, of course, to people who were literate, which isn't everybody, and where we begin to get what we could call the complicated merging of Christian with classical thought, right? And this we can actually see attestations to in the west portals of Chartres Cathedral, which are about 1145. And I don't have slides of that with me, but they're actually representations of the ancient scholars, the ancient authors. And it's quite marvelous to see that being represented right in the carvings of the portal.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a sophomore art history major, and I was wondering if you could address what happened to the monastic movement in the Gothic period and how that affected the architecture of the time.
In the monastic movement in general?
Yeah, like I know it really flourished during the Romanesque period, and there were all of these pilgrimage routes and monasteries were built in the countryside, and how that changed at the beginning of the Gothic period.
Right, okay. Well, another huge topic. So, monasteries, as I think you all know, are places of withdrawal from the world, right? They are based largely on in the West, on the rule of Saint Benedict, early 6th century. And the idea was to separate yourself from the town and to go into a place that is lonely and wild and dedicate yourself to prayer and study. And indeed, the continuous transmission of knowledge depended in large measure on that, on monastic communities. Monasteries partake of the Gothic style and of course also build, some of them more ambitiously, some of them with much more restraint. And indeed, I would say it is restraint in architecture that becomes a kind of signifier for monastic buildings in the 12th and 13th century. That is, instead of the kind of huge, ambitious, over-the-top architecture that you see here at Reims, you find monks, especially under the guidance of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, right, articulating the need for an architecture of simplicity, an architecture for those who have turned their back on worldliness, an architecture that in fact expresses spirituality. So we have certain monastic movements. The most conspicuous one is that of Saint Bernard, which is known as a Cistercian order, right, which develops a kind of Gothic style of austerity, a Gothic style of self-abnegation, if you will. And they're trying to use some of the technological advances of Gothic, but to tame it down both in scale and in complexity to something that seems appropriate, right, for the life of abstinence, withdrawal, simplicity, poverty in a generic sense that's represented by monks. Yeah?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lynn Brooks. I'm professor of dance. I studied in the city of Seville for about a year, magnificent cathedral, and I had thought of cathedrals and saw them initially as having tall spires and towers and seemed rather phallic in design. At the Corpus Christi procession, these huge doors of the cathedral opened into the black inner space, out of which emerged the carros carrying statues of Jesus, but mostly of Madonnas. And it was like witnessing a birth. It was quite breathtaking. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on those gendered roles of the cathedral, architecturally and socially.
You mean the processions?
I'm actually thinking about the cathedral, the doors opening and allowing a birth, and then those spires and towers piercing the skies.
Gosh, I've never thought about this, but it's a great thing to think about. I don't know if I could comment on that without more reflection. But it's a really interesting observation. It does bring up a point that I feel I can comment on, and that is, of course, the way in which the cathedral participated and occupied cities through processions, right? By carrying sculpture around cities and marking the city as part of a sacred and ritual space. That's the part of your question that I have a handle on as far as the doors opening and giving birth. Well, as a metaphor, it's an interesting one, and I need to think about it. I don't think I want to say anything about that until I do. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Annalisa Cornell. I'm a mathematician here. So mathematicians and technically trained people sometimes follow the art when there's interesting money to be made and we can contribute in ways. So I'm thinking like modern days, mathematicians get involved with Pixar and making movies and with graphics and video games. So I was wondering to what extent the patronage of the bishops was merely consuming existing art, or in what ways it was actually changing crafts and trades. For example, building these large buildings probably required new technical innovations. Were the bishops drivers of this intellectual curiosity, or were they merely consumers of it?
Both. They were drivers and consumers. I think when you think about these stained glass windows, right, the desire for light, the desire for huge panels, 60 feet tall, right, filled with glass. You've got a technical problem to solve, right? So the urge for luminosity is going to push both artistic and structural engineering questions. And so I would say they exist in a dialogue with each other. And that's an evolving dialogue that is one of empirical practice as well, in some measure of calculation. Now, we have no idea to what extent our medieval architects were even literate, right? Probably they were, probably they did some level of calculation, but I think we also have to think about these builders, or for that matter, the artisans who are making the stained glass windows, right? It's coming out of a crafts tradition where they are, in fact, being trained from their teenage years, working their way into a corporation of workers who develop high-level skills in relation to the task that has been set for them. When Henry of Brenne decides to build the biggest cathedral of his time, This is about 123 feet tall. Right, he starts the cathedral knowing, of course, that there's great expertise in crafts, in the workshop. But obviously, because this is so much bigger, that expertise is pushed and grows and changes. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Finally, please join me in thanking Professor Bruzelius for a stimulating talk.